today we're talking about safety of journalists, and it's important to say that when we link freedom of expression, we're thinking of also freedom of the press, because we're really talking about the right to access information. And this is very important. Freedom of expression can have many reasons. You can have freedom of expression as an artist. You can have freedom of expression as a writer or any other form of art or plastic arts. You can actually have freedom of expression in speech or in journalism. But in the case of accessing information by society, media and journalists play a very important role because they're facilitating access of information for other people. This is why, for us, the definition of journalist is the person, the woman or man, who dedicates themselves systematically to collect information, to organize it, and to transfer it to a specific audience for the purpose of making it of easy understanding, of accessible understanding. And this is constantly done by many people, and it's not such a complicated definition. But it is this function of transferring information that makes the easy access for society that we have to protect, which is why we talk about protection of journalists, and we talk about a plan of safety. There are other sectors of society. We talk about human rights defenders, women or men who are actually dedicating their life to defend the human rights of others. And there again, we're talking about protecting the profession, the service they're giving to society. Well, with journalists and with media workers, it is the issue of protecting the access to information that they facilitate to society. Now, this access to information has another principle that we must follow. And this principle is the principle of diversity and plurality. Diversity of media and plurality of ideas. Diversity of media means that you can have private media, yes, which plays a very important role and should be protected. You have public media, state-sponsored but independent media. But you also have community-based media, which is nonprofit and community-based and community-administered and organized. So it is the combination of all these forms of media, whether it's private, public, or community, that will give us a diversity of perspectives. But then the pluralism is the pluralism of ideas. We also have media from different points of view, different ideologies, different schools of thought, different philosophies. And this is good. This is why the higher education centers are called universities, because the idea is that there are universal centers of thought where all ideas can be debated and can be brought. Well, exactly this is the idea of the press. The press is the space where all ideas and all tendencies should be debated. Of course, there's limitations, and there's limitations. We'll have one other chapter when we'll talk about limitations. But limitations are related to criminal activity using freedom of expression using media. But in general, all the work of the journalists and the media outlets is precisely to guarantee this access to information. And one of the biggest threats we have found is, one is the censorship laws that want to limit that function, limit the content, and they want the state authorities to decide what can be said and not said, and this is an authoritarian regime. This is what happened in the Second World War, where you had regimes that were fascist regimes that were defining the content for everyone. We cannot allow this. We have to have open societies where effectively anyone can debate and participate. But the other threat is the attacks on journalists, which are an indirect form of censorship, because fear is also censorship. So attacks that can be physical attacks, psychological attacks of threats and intimidation, or even legal attacks, because sometimes they suffer legal harassment. For instance, the use of the laws that challenge the way that you treat certain topics in certain countries, that are forbidden issues in certain countries, or supposedly laws that protect honor and reputation of others, and that are limiting the possibility of having an open debate, especially about public figures and public officials. That is a way of legal harassment. But more importantly is the threats, the direct threats, the physical harassment, and the attacks, and the real physical attacks, and the killings, of course. And this is one of the issues that as UNESCO we've been trying to address with the UN Plan of Action. Because if you don't have a safe press, you don't have a free press. So we called it first safety of journalists, not only protection. Protection is one element because we want to have a global view. We believe that safety is a comprehensive plan that every state should have. And this comprehensive plan should have three elements. One is the prevention. This is very important. The prevention can be developed with the security forces, can be developed with the intelligence services, with the journalist associations, even with the public, how the public can perceive danger at a certain moment. And I think this is crucial and this is very important. Prevention should probably be a permanent, constant, systematic focus. The second one is protection. There should be an emergency mechanism in moments of crisis. Normally when a journalist is going to be attacked, there are intimidating factors before. They're being followed, their mail, they're receiving threats on the mail, or their telephones are monitored and they can hear the monitoring, they can perceive it. So with these signals that threats are and that the danger is coming and getting worse, there should be a mechanism of protection. Someone within the state that they should be able to contact and to have some degree of protection or to be able to, at least to move out of the zone, the city, or the region. And the third element, we call it the procurement of justice. This is the 3 Ps. The procurement of justice means that there should be a full investigation into those cases that do occur, whether they are threats, physical acts, or acts of aggression and assassination of journalists. And this has probably been our biggest struggle because, as we have mentioned many times, when an act of violence is not investigated, which is called impunity, the lack of justice, it is when this act will happen time and time again. And every act that remains without investigation is not one more that happens, it's the invitation of many more acts to happen, so it really multiplies itself. So impunity becomes a strong multiplying factor in terms of the threats against journalists. This is why this is something we really have to eradicate, which is why today we believe we have to work with police and security forces. We have to work with prosecutors and public ministries. And we have to work with judges and the judiciary to understand the safety issue beyond the individual and understand how this is challenging the right that all society has of receiving information freely. Now, we have seen that there is a report on assassination of justice, of journalists that UNESCO does every year in November by the Director General. And in this report, she challenges the states that have had these cases to investigate and to send back information for the breaking of the silence and to allowing to see how the investigation and who the culprits were. And we have discovered, for instance, in the year 2016, that 50% of the killings were done in conflict zones and 50% were done in non-conflict countries. This is a very serious situation because this means that even democratic countries that are not in conflict have assassinations of journalists. It's a common phenomenon around the world, in some countries much worse than others, but it's happening around the world. And more seriously, we're seeing an increase in harassment and sexual harassment, especially of women journalists. And this is unacceptable because it's trying to use sexual elements in the intimidation against women journalists because they're trying to silence women and to eradicate them from journalist profession and from being investigative journalists. So I think this is a crucial issue that we're trying to look at when we talk about the dimension of the investigations. A full investigation is fundamental. And if that investigation is well conducted, there should be a report presented then to UNESCO. UNESCO will be expanding not only to killings, but also to arbitrary detention, to cases of torture, and to other disappearance and other forms of physical aggression against journalists. And this is very important because all these forms of aggression form a pattern, because in many countries it is easier for journalists not to document conflicting topics, not to talk about corruption, for instance, or not to talk about environment and contamination of water. So it's just to move into social life, for instance, and other non-controversial issues as a way of survival. This is censorship, because this is taking very important, very relevant information away from the public. And the public ought to know and has the right to know. This is the reason of the UN Plan of Action. We had recently a review process of that Plan of Action, the 5 first years. And we have developed an outcome document with a multi-stakeholder dialogue between state delegations, journalist associations, and civil society organizations, NGOs, and human rights organizations that participated. And the outcome document is a good document of ideas that to provoke people to think of how to enhance this safety of journalists. But the most important aspect of it is to take Goal 16 of the SDGs, that, as we mentioned before, has the 5 conditions for development, and the 5th condition is to guarantee public access to information, and narrow that agenda, which was taken voluntarily by all states in the General Assembly 2 years ago in United Nations, to actually have every state establish a mechanism of safety, a sort of a collective, multi-stakeholder body that will have security authorities of the state, that will have the judiciary authorities, that will have journalist associations representing them, and civil society organizations that can actually be the recipient of this information and can actually analyze the dangers and the risk and develop preventive policies, and eventually can also respond to the information that is requested when acts of violence do occur. This is one of our proposals, to have every country of the world to have one of these mechanisms to be able to effectively follow up on the SDGs. This SDG, as I said before, is the compliance with human rights, with democracy, and with true development.